So we'll do it like this. So you guys can still see my slides here, right? Okay. So we'll just go ahead and do it like this, just so that way I don't mess this up any more than I already have, I guess. Okay, so in terms of measuring our constructs, it's really important for us to always think about the idea of how do I even know that I'm actually measuring the right thing? And that's always a really big question that we have within the research domain. So when we think about the validity associated with our results, one of the biggest complaints I think that everyone always gets is, so I did all this research, am I truly measuring whatever it is that I was wanting to measure? So for instance, some of you in your research ideas were proposing wanting to investigate issues related to autism, issues related to depression, issues related to self-esteem and motivation, and all these different kind of factors. And that's all great, but one of the issues that we always come across is, how do we know at the end of the day that when we finished our research study that you actually measured some issue related to autism, some issue related to depression, some issue actually related to motivation or self-esteem? And that's really where the idea of making sure that we measure our construct to the best of our abilities comes into play. So whenever it is that we're looking at this issue of wanting to make sure that we know what it is that we're measuring, we already have the idea behind our research study that we said, okay, I'm interested in exploring the issues related to personality, so looking at the differences between introverts and extroverts on motivation, for instance, right? So now we have to make sure that we measure correctly personality and that we also measure correctly motivation. Because if we don't measure them correctly, the validity associated with our results goes out the window, and it doesn't even matter how good our research study was, but if I don't actually have a valid measure of my constructs, there's no way that I can draw conclusions about my behavior that I'm interested in. So here what I need to make sure of is I need to make sure that I actually have the selection of the right predictors associated with my experiment, and I also need to understand what role each one of the variables that I'm selecting are actually going to take place within the research domain. So in other words, how do I make sure that I know exactly what my independent variable is and what my dependent variable are, and also what types of dependent variables and what kinds of dependent variables it is that I'm dealing with in terms of research? So when we look at this idea of looking at the different types of variables, the very first distinction that we'll talk about here is the distinction of understanding between independent and dependent variables. Now, this is something that we should all know as a core foundation of any scientific discipline. And within psychology, it's no different, that we select independent variables and we also select dependent variables within our research studies. So whenever it is that we're talking about an independent variable is the predictor of interest, and that's the predictor that we assume is either going to be manipulated or observed. And this is very important that we understand this distinction here, that it can either be manipulated or observed. So it doesn't always have to be manipulated in the sense of, well, it's always under my direct control, because there are going to be some independent variables that we're not going to be able to control specifically, but we can still treat them as being an independent variable, such as with the idea of having them be a predictor variable or also being what we call the influencer. So these are all the names that we call an independent variable. The predictor, the influencer, these are all the factors that we assume might potentially affect whatever it is that we're going to measure at a later point in time, meaning my dependent variable. So in our example here of looking at the differences between introverts and extroverts on motivation, my independent variable is personality type. Are they introverted or are they extroverted? Now here, with this idea of introverted versus extroverted, this is not going to be a manipulated independent variable. Even though it is the predictor in my research study, it's still not a manipulated independent variable because I cannot change that and I cannot control that within my participants. So person number one can't walk into the room and me randomly assign them to one of the two groups and say, today you're going to be introverted, today you're going to be extroverted, when that doesn't correspond with their actual behaviors. So rather, we have to ask them and say, can you please tell us, are you introverted, are you extroverted? Or we give them an assessment and then we make a decision if they are introverted or extroverted based on the information that they've given us. We can create that categorization based on that specific assessment, but that's never something that we can actually manipulate or control. So we're going to label that as being an observed independent variable. Now with our dependent variable, this is what we're going to call the criterion, or we're also going to call it the influenced. So in other words, this is the variable that we assume is going to be influenced by the independent variable. Now, it doesn't always mean that it will be influenced, but we assume that it may or may not have an actual effect on it. So in our particular case, this is going to be whatever it is that we're going to be measuring our participants on. So in our particular example, looking at the difference between introverts and extroverts on motivation, motivation would be my dependent variable. So here we assume that there may potentially be a difference between introverts and extroverts on motivation in this particular case that we're measuring at a later point in time. Now, one of the easiest ways for us to always make sure that we understand what the relationship is between an independent variable and a dependent variable and which one is which within our research study is really easy using the following sentence. The effects of the independent variable first on the dependent variable second. We always talk about it in this particular fashion. Even the way that you all presented your research ideas to me in terms of our mini assignment number 1, you all gave me the idea of which one was going to be my independent variable and which one was going to be my dependent variable in that specific case. So one of the things that we always have to consider is making sure that we know which one is my IV, which one is going to be my dependent variable. Questions up to this point? All right, perfect. And again, this is something basic that we all should have learned many, many years ago in terms of a basic science-based course. But again, it's always nice for us to revisit it. And again, we've always had this stereotyped image that our independent variable always has to be manipulated in its nature, when in reality, it doesn't always have to be manipulated. We can also have an observed independent variable, and that's a very important distinction that we don't always make within science. All right, so when we think about this distinction of independent versus independent versus dependent variable and the types of independent variables that we do encounter, so again, the issue of manipulated versus observed, remember that with a manipulated independent variable, this means that it has to be under my direct control. And it means it has to be under my direct control in every single one of its capacities. So here, it's not enough for us to say, well, we're interested in selecting only males who are between the age of 12 to 16 years of age. That's not it being manipulated in its nature. Manipulation would be, I assign you your specific age and I also assign you your specific gender. That's the idea of having that manipulation. And we know we can't do that, so rather what are we left with? We're left with an observed independent variable, in this particular case, being something that I can only observe in my participants, but I cannot directly manipulate, I cannot directly affect it in any way, but rather the participant just self-reports that, or I give them an assessment, and based on their assessment, I then self-categorize. Now, this also brings us to a very important point associated with observed variables. Now, when we think about an observed variable, it's very important to understand what our role is as a researcher. And our role as a researcher is not to question participants. So if a participant comes in and they may be clearly female and they tell us that they are male, that is no place for a researcher to say, yeah, I don't believe you. Let me go ahead and put you in the female group anyways because I can make that decision that you're actually female. We definitely don't do that, and we as psychology students and as psychology professionals all know that we should never do that, because here that person may self-identify as another gender, and for us we have to say, all right, well, the participant said that this was their gender. We're going to go ahead and place them in that specific group, and we're going to then deal with their data at a later point in time. Now, if at that point you're concerned about the validity associated with that data, so you're concerned that the participant themselves may not be an adequate representation of the population that you're interested in examining at this point, here you may flag their data, you may just mark it on their chart, you may mark it on their packet for the research packet that you've created, or whatever it is that you want to do just to identify that later on you may want to withhold that data because it's questionable in its nature and you don't want it to affect your results in a negative fashion. Everyone with me so far? All right, perfect, good. Now, the next distinction here that I'll present for you all is the idea of a person versus environmental factor. And again, here, this generally relates to the idea of the independent variables that we're generally measuring within a participant. So here, when a person comes into our research setting, right, whatever that setting may be, let that be in a lab or let that be in the field, whatever the case is, they already come with a lot of things associated with who it is that they are. We're going to call those factors person variables. So these are things that the person already brings with them to the research situation. Things like their gender, their personality, socioeconomic status, education level. And again, these are things that generally we cannot manipulated in this specific instance. Now, since the issue of not being manipulated comes into play with gender and personality, there are other things that we may potentially manipulate that may be considered a person variable, such as an individual's anxiety, for instance. So an anxiety, that's already something that they bring with them, but then again, we can technically manipulate that factor and make their anxiety levels increase or decrease or do whatever it is that we want them to do, because that's something that is amendable to measurement and amendable to manipulation whenever it is that we're interested in that. But generally speaking, whenever it is that we do talk about a person variable, we do talk about these issues of an individual difference. These are things that the person already brings with them to the research situation that we really don't have a direct control over, or that we ethically cannot change in any way, shape, or form in this particular instance. And again, lots of different factors may contribute to this idea of a person variable. Can you all think of a couple of different ones that might fall into this category of a person variable? Age, absolutely. Sexual orientation, absolutely. What else? Educational background, religious affiliation, political affiliation, where they live, how much they eat, if they're vegetarian versus pescatarian or whatever it is that you want. These are things that you're not in direct control. So absolutely, and as we continue to do research, we're going to find so many more of these that you're going to say, man, we really can't manipulate that much whenever it is that we evaluate information about the individuals in these particular types of situations. Everyone good? Perfect. So now let's talk about environmental variables. Environmental variables are generally factors or situations that, again, may or may not be under the researcher's direct control. So here, when you think about an environmental factor, think about the noise that's in the atmosphere. So here, for instance, right now, I'm lecturing. I'm hopefully under the idea that I have very specific control over my research situation, my presenting situation in this particular instance. There is not going to be any distractions. And right now, we had somebody walk into the room and go to the back of the desk. Did you all see that? No. Oh, okay. So somebody walked into the room where I'm at, into my office, and they checked all the trash cans. They went to the back of the room and then came and said hi to me really quick. That to me is a little bit of a distraction, and it throws me off my game whenever it is that I'm trying to do my lecture. But at the same time, you guys may have felt that, or you may not have felt it, or even realize that may have happened, but yet that is an environmental factor that may potentially have been under my control or not control. So here, for instance, maybe me putting up a sign may have said, no, don't come in, no, don't bother me at this time, I'm lecturing, so that way we minimize those types of factors that might potentially contribute to something that we would call error variance in this particular case. Or even think, for instance, the temperature of the room, the lighting of the room, how many people are in the room, what color the walls are, what kind of smells are in the room, what do people around you smell like. All of those things are going to be environmental factors that we, again, may or may not be under our direct control under those situations. Now, ideally here, we would always want to control all of our factors, even person variables and even environmental variables. Why do you think we would always want to control all person variables and all environment variables as well? Why do you guys think that? Absolutely. So here, what do we want to do? We want to make sure that we're getting the best results that we possibly can. Either that the results are going to be consistent or that the results are going to be valid at the end of the day. And we want to make sure that the conclusions that we draw about the behavior that we're examining are always going to be the best representation of the work that we could have possibly collected, and they are the best representation of the effect that actually exists out in the real world in terms of how the real world truly does exist in this particular instance. Other questions, concerns at this point? Everyone good? All right. So now let's look at our next distinction here. Our next distinction is the issue related to what we call exogenous and endogenous variables. For many of you, this may be a new kind of terminology that we're presenting here, but it is something that we always have to examine whenever it is that we're doing research. And looking at the issue related to exogenous and endogenous variables are always very important because we have to understand what the role of exogenous and endogenous variables are going to be within a research situation. So whenever it is that we're looking at exogenous versus endogenous variables, what are we referring to here? An exogenous variable is essentially a variable that's not caused by anything else other in our model. Now, what do we mean by this? We essentially mean whenever it is that we're discussing our research situation or our research study, we're assuming that here this potential factor stands alone. It's not being affected by anything else out there in the world or our research situation. Even though we know that out there in the real world, there may be some potential factors that might affect that specific variable. So think of something like socioeconomic status, the effect of socioeconomic status on employment opportunities. Okay, let's just assume that we're going to look at that. So what we want to do is we want to compare people who are high socioeconomic status versus low socioeconomic status on opportunities of getting employed or not out there in the real world. So one of the things that we assume here within our research situation is that there are no other factors that are contributing to the issue related to socioeconomic status, that it stands alone. But we realize that socioeconomic status may actually be affected by other factors that actually exist out there in the real world. So if you had to think about other factors that might potentially affect status, what would you think might be a couple? Education, absolutely. Opportunity to even be able to get out of their situation, sure. Language, if they have any language barriers, sure, absolutely. What else? The environment that they're raised in, exactly right. So do they even grow up in an environment where they had the opportunity to be able to become high socioeconomic status or moderate, or they are always just going to be predisposed to being low socioeconomic status because of the environment that they live in? Absolutely. What about race, ethnicity, religion, gender? All of these things might potentially contribute, right? Absolutely. But where are they, right? So whenever it is that we talk about our research situation, we said, well, we want to look at the differences between high and low socioeconomic status on employment opportunities. Well, what happened to all those other factors? Well, here in our research situation, we're going to assume it to be an exogenous variable. So in other words, this factor is going to stand alone. Nothing else can affect it. Nothing else is touching it. Nothing else is modifying it in any way. We assume it's going to stand alone, and that's that. That's the idea of an exogenous variable. Even though we know that out there in the real world, and even here in our research situation, it is being affected by other factors, we're going to assume that within our research situation, it's not being affected by other factors. Now, it may possibly be affected by other potential exogenous variables, but generally here we assume that it's not going to be affected by anything else. So essentially here, what we're going to be looking at is we're going to look at our exogenous variable as if it were our independent variable. We're going to assume it to be the predictor in this particular case. And just as an independent variable is, it may potentially be manipulated or it may be observed. So in our particular case, something like socioeconomic status, it's something that's observed. I can't manipulate that. So in our particular case, it's an observed exogenous variable in this particular situation. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. Now here, we now switch our attention to looking at the factor that is being affected at a later point in time, which is the issue of what we say is going to be called our endogenous variable. Now, endogenous variables essentially are factors that are created because of an exogenous variable in this particular case. So in other words, whenever it is that we see in our particular model, in our particular research situation, employment opportunities, we assume that employment opportunities are going to be affected by socioeconomic status in our particular setup that we've created. But yet we also know that there may be other factors that might potentially affect something like employment opportunities. So what other things other than socioeconomic status might potentially affect something like employment opportunities? We'll say that one more time. If they have a disability or not. Jobs, absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. So are there even any available positions where they live? Sure. What's that? Say that one more time. Sure, absolutely. So an economic situation that we may have in the country, absolutely. What else? Transportation, if they can even get to the job themselves or not, right? So what's the point of you being a high or low socioeconomic status individual when you can't even get to that job? It's not even going to matter. What about education? Again, gender, race, ethnicity. What's that? Say that one more time. The language again. So do they even have the skills to be able to perform in that specific job? You know, they may be required to speak two languages, but they only know one. Absolutely. So here, again, we understand that there may be other factors that may potentially be affecting our endogenous variable in this particular instance, but yet we're going to assume that only the exogenous variable, if the endogenous variable does change, we assume that the exogenous variable is the one that's responsible for the effect on the endogenous variable in this particular case. So here, with an endogenous variable, even though it is taking the effect from the exogenous variable, and so here we assume that it may change because of the exogenous variable, we also understand that that particular factor might then affect other things at a later point in time. So here in our specific model, we look at the differences between high and low socioeconomic status on employment opportunities. Now, once it is that we see employment opportunities that we're going to label as an endogenous variable because it's being affected by the exogenous variable, now we look at the endogenous variable of employment opportunities after it's been affected by socioeconomic status. Can this particular new variable of employment opportunities affect other things? What do you guys think? Sure. So I'll say it again. Sure. Absolutely. So here we saw the effect of the exogenous variable on the endogenous variable, right? So it may or may not have an effect. So let's say, for instance, people who are high socioeconomic status have better employment opportunities for whatever the reason may be, right? We don't know that because we haven't explored any of those other factors in our model, only socioeconomic status. So we see that difference in employment opportunities. Now, can employment opportunities potentially affect other things in the future? Okay, absolutely. Like what? Okay, so it may affect stress, it may affect living conditions, it may affect promotions, so on and so forth, right? So we understand here that now this endogenous variable, whatever the effect it is that it has from the exogenous variable, can now potentially affect other things, okay? That's a very important issue that we have to understand. So again, the exogenous variable affects the endogenous variable. That endogenous variable then still remains endogenous, but it may affect other endogenous variables in the future. Now, the reason that our second variable here, our endogenous variable of employment opportunities, remains endogenous and doesn't convert itself into an exogenous variable is because of the previous exogenous variable that's affecting it in this specific model. And remember, an exogenous variable can never be affected by anything else. It stands alone in our model, and here it's not. Okay, so here, let's look at another example of this just to kind of put this into perspective. So here, for instance, we see on the left-hand side of the screen the issue related to motivation. Motivation in our particular case is going to be labeled as our exogenous variable. Now, the reason it's labeled as exogenous variable is because, again, it stands alone. Nothing in our model, so this is our entire model, nothing in our model is potentially affecting motivation, even though we know that other factors might potentially affect motivation, right? Okay. And how do we know that nothing else is affecting it? There's no other boxes to the left of it with arrows pointing towards motivation. If there were, then this motivation factor wouldn't be exogenous, but rather it would be endogenous because it's being affected by other potential factors that we have here. Everyone good? Perfect. So now, for instance, we can see what the effects of motivation are on other factors, something like test performance and also on something like studying. So here, both test performance and studying are going to be labeled as our endogenous variables. And now they're labeled as endogenous. Why? Well, correct. So here, they're potentially being affected by motivation. Now, we don't know if they are or aren't, but we assume that it may or may not in this particular case. So test performance and studying, we're going to assume are affected by motivation in this particular case. Exactly right. So here, test performance may have an effect because, or may change because of motivation. Studying habits may change because of motivation levels as well. Now, here are endogenous variables. We still look at those, and now with their new scores or with their new assessment, we now look at their effect at something later on. So in other words here, test performance now may potentially affect grades, while your studying habits may also potentially affect your grades. So indirectly, motivation may affect your grades, but the reason that motivation affects your grades is because motivation may affect your test performance and your studying habits, and those affect your grades. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. Okay, so in this model, tell me what my exogenous variable is. Just motivation, and that's it. The easiest way that we know which one is our exogenous variable is because no arrows are pointing to it, and it's the one that's farthest to the left. Everyone good? Perfect. Everything else then is what? Endogenous or exogenous? Endogenous, and it will always remain endogenous. So here, for instance, when we look at the effect of motivation on test performance and studying, these two are endogenous. Now when we look at the effect of test performance and studying habits on grades, they still remain endogenous. Why? Well, say that one more time, because they were being affected by which one? By motivation. Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly correct. So they're still endogenous because they're still being affected by another factor. Now here, the point that you brought up is very important. Could it be a possibility that test performance and studying habits may affect each other? So could we have a bidirectional arrow or two arrows here, one pointing down and one pointing up, that may indicate that they may affect each other? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So here, test performance might affect your studying habits. Your study habits affect your test performance again, so on and so forth. But again, they still remain endogenous in their method. Everyone good? Perfect. If we take away motivation, which ones are then going to be exogenous? If we take away motivation. Exactly right. So test performance and studying will become exogenous because now we assume that nothing is affecting them in our model. And then grades would be the only endogenous factor in this particular case. Everyone good? Questions, concerns up to this point? Perfect. And I know this is kind of like a newer thing that we're introducing here related to how it is that we identify factors in our models. But just remember here the idea of exogenous and endogenous, which one is being affected by what, and also the relationship that they have with the independent and dependent variables. So here in our particular case, motivation would be considered our independent variable, test performance and studying habits would be our dependent variables. But now whenever it is that we look at the effects of test performance and studying, even though they were dependent variables at that point, now they become the independent variable, and now grades become the dependent variable in that new setup that we have, even though they still remain endogenous. Everyone good? Perfect, good. All right, so now let's move on to talking about probably one of the most important things that we'll ever talk about within the field of research as a whole. And that's the issues related to reliability and the issues related to validity. And they're very, very important issues. Now, before we actually begin talking about reliability and validity issues, let's first talk about constructs and operational definitions again. Even though we've already been talking about them for the past 2 weeks, we're still going to talk about them again. And the reason that I continue to talk about them is because they're that important, that we have to understand that relationship that they have between each other. Now, what's the relationship that we see between constructs and operational definitions? Constructs, again, are going to be these abstract ideas that we're working with. So it's this abstract idea or this image that serves as an explanatory term that we have related to that specific topic at hand. So in other words, whenever it is that we use the term motivation, studying, grades, GPA, those are all constructs in their nature. None of these things have any actual concreteness at this point, but rather now what do? We apply an operational definition. By now applying the operational definition, we can now then have this concrete idea that supports the idea of the construct in this particular instance. So in other words, what are we going to classify as motivation? Well, motivation is going to be the assessment of either being high or low on a motivation assessment tool. How are we going to define GPA? GPA is going to be the grade point average that's going to be given by the institution at the end of the year. So now here we have concrete ideas that support the idea of the construct itself. And here, again, it's very important that we as researchers have to have faith in that specific definition. And this is why I place here for you the idea of the leap of faith. So this is the belief that we're actually measuring what it is that we assume to be measuring in our assessment tools, and that we're talking about and drawing conclusions about what it is that we want to be talking about and drawing conclusions about. So in other words, when I conclude at the end of the day about the effects of motivation on test scores, I want to make sure, and I have to have faith, that I am sure that my assessment tool did truly measure motivation and my assessment tool did truly measure the test score. That's very, very important. If I don't have faith in that as the primary researcher, how am I ever going to transmit faith to others that what I'm doing is actually valid and honest research and it's actually making an impact within our field? But rather, people are going to be distrustful. People are going to say that probably doesn't really measure it. But here, it's all about the way that I present it and convincing others that it really does truly measure what it is that we assume to be measuring. And again, we also do have to have issues related to reliability and validity that we're going to talk about. But again, I'm one of the primary factors that I have to have faith in the belief that I'm measuring what I'm truly intending to measure and that my definition truly does capture that construct of interest. Very, very important relationship. Any questions, concerns up to this point? Perfect. All right, so now how do we actually do this? How do we actually maximize the leap of faith? How do we actually maximize and say, hey, you know what? I'm reducing that gap between the idea that my assessment tool doesn't truly measure whatever it is that I'm interested in. So for instance, some of you may have potentially used some assessment tools within your practicums or within your practices already that you may administer, for instance, self-esteem questionnaire, or you may give out a adjustment questionnaire or a depression inventory, for instance. You may give out a battery of all these different assessments, and at the end of the day, you read the output in terms of the results, and you have to have a faith and belief that that assessment tool does truly measure your construct of interest, right? Absolutely. But now here, one of the things that I want to try to do is I want to try to minimize the gap of uncertainty that I have, because there's always going to be a level of uncertainty. There's always going to be that level. And what is it that I want to do as a researcher? I want to try to minimize that gap between the uncertainty that I have that my operational definition and my assessment tool does truly capture that specific construct. So how do I do that? I do that by maximizing two very important factors. And those two factors are reliability and validity. Very, very important factors that I want to try to maximize. All right, everyone good? All right, perfect. So now let's talk about how to actually maximize reliability and validity, because they're very, very important issues that we have to talk about. All right, so first let's look at the issue related to reliability. So when we talk about reliability, and we are always discussing this particular issue of reliability, it's very, very important that we get reliability and validity correctly identified. I remember this as an anecdote that happened to me years and years and years ago. I was an undergraduate student taking a class in some other discipline. I was taking an elective class, and the professor asked what the difference was between reliability and validity. So no one answered in the class, and I had been taking a couple of psych classes, and I had taken a research methods class, and they taught us what reliability and validity were. So I raised my hand and I answered the question. I told them what they were. And the instructor told me, actually, you have them backwards. And I didn't. I actually had them correct. And it kind of stuck with me for a really long time that I was like, man, like I would assume that we all understand reliability and validity, and that all researchers and that all practitioners and all professors and everyone out there in the world does truly understand what reliability and validity mean and that what they actually represent. But the idea is that people don't actually know what reliability and validity are in the correct fashion. People understand the concepts, but the problem that they have is understanding how it actually applies to actual human behavior. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. How do we actually use reliability to assess human behavior, and how do we use that behavior to actually confirm reliability or discredit it, because that's what we may want to do in some particular instances. And also, how do I use human behavior to indicate validity, and how do I make sure that what I'm drawing conclusions about are actually valid concepts and valid conclusions about my constructs of interest. And that's going to be very, very important. So here, if you ever get questioned about why it is that that assessment tool is reliable and why it's valid, you will now have an answer as to why it's reliable and not why it's reliable and valid, not because it's reliable and not valid. It's got to be both. Why it's reliable and valid, and you'll justify and say, this is why we use this tool, because it's a best practice, because it does provide us with the best responses, and that's what we're looking for. Everyone good? Perfect. Okay, so what is reliability? The best definition that we actually have of reliability is the following. Reliability is the extent to which a measure eliminates random error variance. Now, we've talked about error variance multiple times already this semester, and please remind me what error variance is. I brought it up again, didn't I? How dare I? Exactly correct. So in other words, we have differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So in other words, I may give two individuals the exact same information, but yet when I give them a test, their scores might differ just a little bit. What are we going to attribute the difference in the scores to? We're going to attribute that difference in the scores to error variance. Now here, it may not be a significant or extreme difference. So here, one person may not score a 90 and another person a 45, but rather a person might score a 90 and the other person might score a 91, or the other person might score an 89. So they're right there, but that difference in the score is just due to that random error variance, or potentially an individual difference that we may categorize it as. So here, what does reliability try to do? Reliability tries to eliminate that random error variance. So in other words, what we try to do is we try to say, what we want to do is that when we give the same assessment every single time, scores are always going to be given in the exact same fashion. So in other words, person 1 gets the assessment tool, they score a 90. The next time around, person number 1 again gets the exact same assessment, we would expect them to also get a 90. We don't want them to now get a 50 or get 100, but rather they have to stay within that same realm. They have to stay within that same score for us to be able to conclude reliability. So in other words, reliability is really the extent to which a measure only assesses one construct every single time. How do we assess one single construct? We do that in two very specific fashions. We measure it through what we call stability, and we also measure it through what we call consistency. Those are our two qualities that we measure reliability on. Very, very, very important estimates that we have to be able to use within research. That we look at stability and we look at consistency as indicators of reliability. Very, very important. Questions up to now? Perfect. So again, easiest way to remember reliability, the same thing always occurs every single time. The same thing always happens. We're talking about reliability. Now here, one of the things you'll notice is I haven't talked about being right about what I'm measuring. I don't know if I'm correct or not in what I'm measuring. All I know is that I'm measuring the same thing every single time. Everyone with me so far? Okay, and that's very, very important. So here, for instance, I could come in a couple of weeks and give you all an exam, and me assume that you're getting a test on psychology, but really it's a physics exam, and your scores are the same every single time I give you the exact same exam, and I only look at the scores. I don't look at the content of what's in there. I only look at the scores. And by looking at the scores, I realize, hey, you know what? We have reliability. We have the same scores across all these time frames. Technically, I am reliable because I'm measuring the same thing every single time. But am I measuring the right thing? I don't know. And that's the problem that we have with reliability. Reliability is not going to indicate validity. And that's very important. Reliability does not indicate validity. It may indicate validity, but it doesn't exactly and inherently indicate validity in this particular case. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. And again, think of it like this. You have an employee. The employee always shows up at 8 a.m. Every single day. They're always there at 8 a.m. 8 a.m., 7:59, 8:01. But they're always very much at the same exact time. What do we classify that employee as? They're very consistent. Does that mean that they're good at their job? No, they may be the worst employee you've ever hired. They could be horrifying. They may get all the orders wrong. They may bring down your business and put you under, right? But they're always there at 8 a.m. Well, you know what? At least they're consistent. I'll say that. Everyone with me? Perfect. Okay. And again, why I keep reiterating this so much is I was on my drive up here. I was listening to a radio talk show, and they were talking specifically about this. That they were like, "Oh yeah, you know that person is very consistent. That's how you know that they're telling the truth." No, you don't. Just because they tell you the same thing every single time doesn't mean anything about it being true or not. I could lie to you 1,000 times in a row, and you would assume what? Nothing else other than he tells the same lie every single time, or he says the same thing every single time. Not that he's actually telling the right thing or the truth in this particular case. Everyone with me? Perfect. Okay, so now let's look at how we actually, bless you. So now let's turn our attention to talking about how we actually assess reliability. Because remember, reliability is going to be assessed in two qualities: stability and consistency. Now, whenever it is that we're talking about stability, stability means, are the scores stable from time 1 to time 2? Are they going to be stable across time periods? And that's very, very important for us for the establishment of reliability with the issue of stability. Now here, if scores remain consistent across multiple time periods, we're going to assume that we have stability, which is going to be, again, one of those qualities associated with reliability. Now, what do we mean by across multiple time periods? We may mean come in at time 1, do the assessment, come in at time 2, do the exact same assessment, but what we have to make sure of is that we do not have any intervention or any type of factor that might potentially change the score in between. That is very, very important to understand. If a factor or a manipulation or an intervention or a treatment occur in between time 1 to time 2, that may potentially disrupt your scores from time 1 to time 2. Everyone with me? Perfect. So here you develop a brand new depression inventory. You administer it to your patients to see if you have stability, if you're reliable across all these time periods. So in other words, you get the same score across all these time periods. You give them the new assessment. They give you a score of, I don't know, a 90, let's say, for however it is that we're designating our assessment. They give you a score of a 90. The second time around, they come in and they give you a score of a 30. And you look at that and you're like, oh man, I guess my assessment tool is not reliable. Why would you conclude that if your score went from a 90 to a 30? Why would you assume that your measure is not reliable? Say it again. It's not stable. It's not stable. Everyone with me? It's not stable. So the scores haven't stayed the same. The aspect of consistency is going to mean something a little bit different in just a couple of minutes here. So here, our scores are not stable. So here, if our scores were to remain the same, the person gets a 90 at time 1, time 2 an 89, an 88, a 91, and 92, no big deal. We're fine. We're still pretty stable within our scores. But if the person does not, and the person goes from a 90 to a 30, here I've already lost stability from the get-go. That's a big problem for me, and I'm going to assume that my measure is not reliable because my scores have drastically changed. If my scores drastically change, that potentially means that I'm measuring different things within my assessment tool. And that's not what I want to have. I want to measure only one single thing within my assessment tool in this particular case. Everyone with me so far? Now, you may later find out that Susie Q gave them an intervention technique. So they came in, filled out your depression inventory, and as soon as they left, Susie Q was like, hey, I need research participants. I developed a brand new intervention technique. Come on in. Gave them the intervention technique. Now they come back at time 2 a day later, and now all of a sudden, their scores are drastically different, and you draw conclusions that your measure is not stable, when in reality it may be stable. The problem was the intervention that occurred in between. So here, the key is no intervention in between. Nothing should happen. Everyone good? Perfect. So here, with the aspect of stability, we're going to do this through what we call test-retest reliability. With test-retest reliability, means exactly what we've been talking about. We give them the assessment, they go home, we give them the assessment again later on, scores should remain stable. They should have a high positive correlation. In other words, the scores should be related to each other. Whenever it is that we talk about correlations and we talk about positive correlations, very, very important. Here, very quick stats kind of tangent here. Don't get freaky, don't get all freaked out on me, please. Everyone good? Okay, so little stats tangent here. Correlations, they look at the relationship between continuous factors. In other words, we look at the relationship between factors that fall in a number line. That's all that we mean by that. Okay? When we talk about a high positive correlations or positive relationships occur when our scores go up together or they go down together. Okay? The same movement needs to occur. If the scores are going up together, that's good news for us. If the scores are going down together, that's still good news for us with test-retest reliability. Okay? Because if your scores were low at time 1, at time 2, you still want your scores to remain low. That still will demonstrate stability because your scores haven't drastically changed. Everyone with me? Perfect. When your scores move in opposite directions, okay, so the one goes down, one goes up, or one goes up and one goes down, whatever the case may be, that's going to give you what we call a negative correlation. Okay, so we have a negative correlation. All that means is that the movement is different in this particular case. If that happens in test-retest reliability, that you have a negative correlation, that's bad news. And it's bad news because it means that your scores are moving in opposite directions throughout the time periods, and that's not a good thing. Everyone good? Perfect. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of a break right now. It's already 5 o'clock on my watch. I want to give you guys a little bit of a break. We'll come back at 5:10 and we'll pick class back up and we'll go through the issues related of consistency. And then we'll also begin to talk a little bit about your literature reviews. All right? Take a little bit of a break. We'll come back up at 5:10. Video here. There we go. So we left off talking about issues related to reliability, and we were talking about how first we always measure the issue of stability prior to anything else, making sure that our scores are going to be stable from time 1 to time 2 to time 3 and so on and so forth, making sure that that gives us or that ensures us some sense of reliability in the idea that we are at least measuring the same thing multiple times, especially that no intervention occurred in between. Now, the second way that we are going to measure reliability is through what we call consistency. Now, with the issue of consistency, this is where we're now going to look at our measure throughout itself. So in other words, let's look at our assessment tool and let's see if it's consistent throughout itself. So the issue of reliability or the issue of stability is the score stable from time 1 to time 2 for that assessment? Now what we're doing with consistency is we're taking the actual document itself and we're scanning through it and making sure that the items amongst themselves are actually consistent. Because one of the things that might potentially happen is that, let's say for instance, the first block of 5 questions are really good. The second block of 5 questions, you're getting a little bit tired. The third set of questions, you've already had 2 glasses of wine, it's 2 in the morning and you're just wanting to get the stuff done. So now the last set of questions, they don't even relate to anything at all. And that's what might potentially happen. That whenever it is that we're actually designing assessment tools need to be completed in parts. Because if we decide that we want to do it all at one single time, it's nearly impossible for us to be able to get all the questions within the assessment tool done correctly in a consistent fashion that's also going to lead us down the path of potentially looking at a valid measure. And that's very important. So now what do we have to do? We have to look at that assessment tool and say, are you consistent throughout? The best way that I can think of this is if you've ever taken an exam and a professor throws in some like really kind of out of left field kind of questions that you're just like, where did this question even come from? And the professor's like, oh yeah, I got that question from the wrong chapter. I do apologize. So don't worry about it. That makes the measurement, that assessment tool, less consistent. Or if they throw in questions such as, for this question, answer A. Well, how does that assessment, how does that question correspond in a valid fashion to the actual construct of interest? If I'm trying to get at the idea of, do you have knowledge? Why would I ever throw in a question saying just write letter A and that's the right answer? Well, I mean, that kind of is a free question there and a free answer that really doesn't measure anything. And that might potentially happen within your assessment tool. Everyone with me? Perfect. So here with consistency, again, I want to make sure that my assessment tool is going to be consistent throughout itself at each time frame as well. So what are we going to look for? We're going to look for high positive correlations between participants' responses to different items or different components that are measured at a single time point. So in other words, if we have 10 questions, one of the things that I'm going to do is I'm going to try to break up my assessment tool into different parts, maybe the first 5 questions and then the second set of 5 questions, and I'm going to see if there's a relationship between the answers of those sets of questions. If there is a relationship between them, that's good news for me. If there's not a relationship, that's bad news for me. Now, one of the ways that we do this is through what we call split half reliabilities. So what we do with split half reliability is we do the following. And let me just minimize my screen here for a second. And we'll bring this one here. Everyone can see this, right? Okay. So here with our assessment tool, let's assume that my assessment tool has 20 questions. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm not going to count the whole time, sorry. So let's assume that we have these 20 items. Now with these 20 items, one of the things that we could do, we could easily just say, hey, you know what? Do we have test retest reliability? We do? Great, awesome, we're reliable. Yeah, but again, I want to make sure that my survey or my assessment tool throughout itself is going to be consistent. So one of the ways that I could potentially do this is I can say, all right, with split half reliability, what I'm going to do is I'm going to split my survey into 2 sections, part 1 and part 2. Okay, so for part 1, what am I going to do? I'm going to take the sum of my scores. So I'm just going to add up all my scores for the first 10 items. Okay, so let's say, for instance, my survey goes from a scale from 1 to 9, which are the total possibility of my scores for each one of my items. So here, let's say that for my scores for part number 1, I have a total of 80. Okay, that's the total score that I have for these first 10 questions. So for question 1, they gave me a 5, a 4, a 9, an 8, so on and so forth, all the way until I get to an 80. Now what do I do for part number 2 is I take the exact same process. So I look at these now new 10 scores here, next 10 questions, and I look at the score. So now what do? I add them all up, and I find for the second part of my assessment tool, I get a sum of scores of a 20. Okay, that's the lowest it could possibly be if everyone rated a 1 for each one of those items. So here for part 1, I have an 80. For part 2, I have a 20. Now remember what I told you. If we want to look at the aspect of a correlation, we want now to look at our pattern of scores. So do we have scores going up and up or down and down? Do we have scores going up and down or down and up? And if we do have these going up and down, we're going to have a negative correlation. If we have scores going up and up together, we're going to have a positive, or down and down, we're going to have a positive score. So here, what do I want for a consistent assessment tool? If I'm going to use this process of split half reliability, and this is a very rudimentary process that I'm doing here, that I'm just splitting it in half by 10 items. But if I were to have done this in this particular fashion, and I find an 80 and a 20, I'm going to do a statistical analysis that's going to be called my correlation, and I'm going to look at that correlation. And I'm going to see if it's positive or negative, and I'm going to look at the magnitude of that correlation as well, the magnitude of the number. So one of the things that you guys should know is that a correlation can range from a positive one to a negative one. Okay, that's the range of my correlation statistic. Okay, from a positive one to a negative one. It can never exceed a value of a 1. The aspect of a positive or a negative relate again to these issues here. So if it's positive, it just means that our scores are moving together. If it's negative, it means that our scores are moving in opposite directions. In our particular case here, one of my scores is going up, one of my scores is going down. So more than likely, it's going to give me a negative correlation. And here I'm going to make one up, okay? So don't be like, how did he get the number? I'm just making it up. But it's a negative one because I know that my scores are moving in opposite directions in this particular case, okay? So one is going up, one is going down in this particular case. So let's say it's a negative 0.80, okay? In this particular case, I would look at this number for my consistency assessment, and I would say, I do not have a reliable assessment tool. I do not have consistency. And why don't I have consistency? Because throughout the assessment tool itself, I am not finding a high relationship between my sets of scores for set 1 and for set 2. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. Now, the traditional way to do split half reliability is not to do what I just did here of just splitting the first 10 items and the second 10 items. Generally, what you tend to have is what we call the odd-even split half reliability, where you take all the odds, you sum up those scores, you take up all the evens, you sum up those scores. So in that way, you get some from here and some from here, from both the odds and the evens, and then you correlate the sums of the scores for the odds and for the evens to see if there is a relationship between them. If there is that high positive relationship, that's good news for us, and we're probably going to end up having reliability in the form of consistency in this particular case. But if we don't, then that means we're lacking consistency. We're probably going to lack reliability in that particular aspect. Everyone good? Perfect. Okay, so that's one way for us to look at the aspect of consistency. The second way for us to look at the aspect associated with consistency is going to actually look at what's called the internal consistency assessment in this particular case, or what we call the internal consistency through what we call Chrome Box Alpha, okay? Through what we call our Chrome Box Alpha. Now, for internal consistency as a whole, one of the things that we're going to do is, rather than just splitting up our survey in two ways, right? So the odds and the evens, like I was mentioning before, now what we're going to do is we're going to do all possible split halves. So let's say, for instance, one of the ways that we're going to do this, we're going to do it in the following fashion. So give me 1 second here. Let me just change the color of my marker. So that way we can just work on this differently. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to do the following. Rather than just saying, I'm going to split up odds and evens, or the first 10 and the second set of 10 items that we may have here. Rather, now what we're going to do is we're going to split up in all the possible forms that we can. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 4 blocks. I'm going to have block 1, block 2, block 3, and block 4. Everyone good? Okay, perfect. So it's just 4 blocks of 5 questions each. Okay, so again, what might potentially happen with our split half reliability? With our split half reliability, the odds and evens, or even if we just split it up the first 10 and the second set of 10 items, this is what might potentially happen. The first 5 items might be really good. The second 5 items might be really bad, but the first 5 items might pick up some of those scores. So we really wouldn't know what the problem is, because in the second set of blocks, they'd all be bad items, and we might not know that. So here, rather, what we do is we try to make all the possible split half correlations that we possibly can. So what do? We're first going to take the relationship between these two. Then we're going to take the relationship between those two. We're going to take the relationship between those two. between these, between those, and last, between those. So in other words, we should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 R's. Everyone see that? So all that I've done is I've just done the split half reliability aspect, but now with all my different blocks, all the possible combinations in this particular case. So block 1 with block 2, block 1 with 3, 1 with 4, 2 with 3, 2 with 4, and last 3 with 4. Everyone good? Perfect. So now what do we do with internal consistency and with Chromebox Alpha? What we're going to do is we're going to take the average of all those R's. And sorry, let me erase this part right here. There we go. So we're going to take the average of all the R's. The average of the R's, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to have a high positive value in this particular case for that specific average. And remember, my R value can only range between a +1 to a -1. So the maximum value that I can have for my average for my split half reliabilities for Chromebox Alpha is going to be a +1 or a -1. I can't exceed that in any way. So here, what do I want for that particular average? I want that average to be as high as possible. So I want that number to be 0.7 to 0.9 or even to a value of a 1 if I can get it to that. If they go anywhere below that, then we start becoming a little bit concerned. What I want is I want that overall average relationship, so averaging out all the possible split half reliabilities to be a high value in this particular case. If it is a high value in this particular case, that makes me a lot more confident that I actually have a consistent assessment throughout itself, especially looking at all these specific blocks in this particular case, then giving me an idea that I probably do actually have reliability at the end of the day. Everyone good? Questions, concerns at this point? No? Perfect. All right. So now let's shift our attention to talking about reliability, because again, we just finished talking about reliability, sorry. Now let's shift our attention to talking about validity, because this is a very, very important issue. So now that we've established, for instance, that we may have a reliable assessment tool, this doesn't mean I'm valid. So again, remember that reliability means that you're assessing the same thing every single time. That's why we get the same scores every single time with stability, and within itself, we're having very similar scores as well. So here, all that suggests for me is that I'm measuring the same thing either from time 1 to time 2, or even within the assessment tool itself, I'm measuring the same construct. That makes me happy. I'm measuring that one singular construct, one thing, okay? And it's the same thing every single time. Now what do I want to do? I now want to look at the issue of validity. Validity means, are you assessing the correct construct? Reliability doesn't tell me if I'm right. All that reliability tells me is that I keep measuring the same thing over and over and over again, the same thing, but I don't know if I'm actually right in what I'm measuring. Everyone good? Perfect. Okay, so now how do I go about doing this, right? So how do I look at the issue associated with reliability? Now, before we get into assessing reliability, because there are some ways for us to assess it, five different ways for us to assess reliability, let's look first at these particular relationships between reliability and validity. Now, first, reliability does not indicate validity. Very, very important statement that we have. We've already mentioned it a couple of times today. Again, just reiterating that. Number 2, a reliable measure might potentially be valid. So in other words, if you're measuring that one single construct, you might be measuring the right one. Again, I don't know if you're right or wrong. All I know is that you're measuring one single thing, so you might be right, but I know that you're not 100% right, so that's why it doesn't indicate it at all, but it might potentially indicate it. Everyone good? Perfect. And last, an unreliable measure can never be valid. So in other words, if your measure is unreliable, if you have not satisfied stability or consistency, and you are an unreliable assessment tool, then you are not a valid assessment tool in this particular case. Everyone good? Okay, why? So if you're unreliable, why can you not be valid? Say it again. But remember, reliability doesn't tell me that, so I don't know that at that point.
It's because it's different. So if it's not reliable, then you're getting different all the time. Like oxygen, different all the time.
Exactly correct. So reliability means that you're measuring one single thing every single time. If you're unreliable, it means that you're measuring multiple constructs. So how can you ever measure the right construct if you're measuring multiple constructs? One of those multiple ones might be the right one, but are you going to risk it and maybe measure the wrong one? Definitely not. Everyone good? Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so now let's talk about validity. A very important on how to assess validity. There's 5 ways for us to assess validity. The 5 ways that we assess validity are through what we call face and content validity, convergent concurrent validity, divergent discriminant validity, predictive validity, and last, construct validity. Those are our 5 ways that we can actually assess validity. So now first let's talk about face, or what we also call content validity. The easiest way for us to assess if a measurement tool is actually valid or not is by looking at it. Look at the items. Do the items look like if they're measuring the right thing? If they are measuring the right thing, then you're probably measuring the right thing. So for instance, if you wanted to create a self-esteem questionnaire, probably one of the items you might want to put it is, I have low self-esteem. If that's an item that's on your assessment tool, you're probably valid. And why? Because it looks like if it's measuring what it's intending to measure. There's no way around it. Everyone with me? Perfect. Now, face and content validity is the only type of validity that we're allowed to get away with not actually satisfying. Now, why is that a reason to do, right? Or why does that actually happen? And the reason that that happens is because we cannot always ask, hey, and we ask the question. We can't always be that forward with people. That goes back to what we talked about the very first day of class. Part of what humans do, unfortunately, is that they lie. They are what we call socially desirable. What does it mean to be socially desirable? It means that people change their responses to look good. So if you ask a person, how many sexual partners have you had in the last 24 hours, they're not going to give you an honest response. Probably 90% are not going to give you an honest response because of the fear of how they might be judged. So here, rather, what will they do? They will give you a different answer. So what do we have to do with our assessment tools? Since we can't be that forward, one of the ways that we might do this is we might actually hide the intent of our assessment tool by changing our questions around to not make it look like if we're actually assessing that specific issue. Everyone with me? Perfect. So here, for instance, you can't flat out ask a participant. Technically you can, right? But we probably wouldn't want to. You can't say, let's ask about risky behavior, right? Let's say, for instance, that we say an item such as, when I go out on a Friday night, I don't mind experimenting with different drugs. That's a question you probably don't want to ask a participant because they might not give you an honest response. But rather, what you could do is you can ask them multiple questions that might lead you to understanding and inferring that they actually do consume that specific drug. So you might want to say, when I go out at night with my friends, I like to experiment, leaving it in a general fashion. So here it doesn't necessarily look like if you're assessing drug behavior, but that might be the intent later on, because you might have asked them questions about their past drug use. And here, that might now give you the inference that they might potentially be using those drugs in the future. Everyone with me? Perfect. Okay. So again, that's the one that we're allowed to get away with the most in most particular cases. Number 2, convergent, or what we also call concurrent validity. With convergent validity, does it correlate with other measures that have similar constructs of interest that are valid? So in other words, let's say that I've created a brand new assessment technique, right? So here's my new assessment technique. Here's one that's already valid. Okay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to give mine, that's a brand new one, and one that's already been validated, I'm going to give them to the same participant. Okay, so all my participants are going to get both surveys, the new one and the one that's already valid. Now what do I want to do? The scores from my new one, I want to see if they're related to the scores from the one that's already been validated. If my scores relate to each other, I'm going to be happy because it means that probably mine's going to be valid as well. Everyone with me? Perfect. Number 3, divergent, what we also call discriminant validity. With divergent, or what we also call discriminant validity, does the measure correlate with other measures that it should not correlate with? So in other words, do we have measures that are not valid, and does yours correlate with that new measure? So in other words, I have my new assessment tool. Here's one that I know is not valid. Let me give them both to all the participants. Mine should not correlate with the one that's not valid. Everyone with me? Perfect. So here it should correlate with the ones that are valid, and it should not correlate with the ones that are not valid, especially if the ones that are not valid have confounds. So they've been found to have problems with them and that they're not valid. My survey should never correlate with that one there. Questions, concerns? Perfect. All right, number 4, predictive validity. With predictive validity, we ask the question, does it predict a relevant future event? So in other words, what we want to do is we say, we know that we can manipulate behavior in this specific fashion. My assessment tool should capture that behavior as it changes with my manipulation. If it does capture it, then it means I'm valid. So for instance, let's say I'm interested in self-esteem and I create a brand new self-esteem assessment tool. What do? I have a participant come in the room and I start belittling the participant and I start making them feel bad about themselves. So the participant walks in the room and I go, oh man, you know what? I'm really sorry, so-and-so. You don't smell very good. Can you please go to the back of the room away from the rest of the participants? You can still do the study, but just kind of away from everybody. So here now, we assume that their self-esteem is probably dropping. And as the study progresses, we continue to point out the fact that they may smell in this particular case, even though they may not, right? But again, we want to see if my assessment tool does actually work. So here, as the study progresses, now we tell the participant, you know what, we're really sorry, but it seems that, our other participants cannot concentrate because of the smell in the room. Would you actually be able to complete the assessment tool outside? Right? So just go outside, complete it outside, just put it in under the door. Don't even come back in, just put it under the door. So now we would assume that their self-esteem is through the floor at this point. Now we give them our self-esteem assessment that we just created. What should my self-esteem assessment indicate? My self-esteem assessment should indicate that my participant has very low self-esteem. My assessment tool should never say, oh yeah, your participant has high self-esteem, you're good to go. Rather, my assessment tool should say, no, the participant has low self-esteem because you created that low self-esteem in them. If it says that it's high, I have a non-valid assessment tool in this particular case. Everyone good? Perfect. Last, the issue of construct validity. With construct validity, at the end of the day, we make a judgment call if our assessment tool does truly measure that construct of interest. So at the end of the day, does my assessment tool measure my construct? So does it actually measure self-esteem in this particular case? And I have to make that decision based on the other criteria here that we've shown. Everyone good? Perfect. Questions, concerns at this time? No? Perfect. All right, so that wraps up our discussion associated with general research questions and designs for these 2 weeks. So technically we're done with lecture for today, but the last thing I want to talk to you all about is a little bit about your literature reviews. Now, one of the things I asked you all to do was to watch the videos on the literature reviews and also on how to find research articles. Were you all able to do that? Perfect. All right. So here, let me just point out a couple of things about the literature reviews if you have some questions, because you might actually have some questions in regards to the literature review. Now, before we begin, has anyone done literature reviews in the past? Okay, so everyone's pretty familiar with it to the most part, but for those of us who aren't familiar with doing literature reviews for the purposes of a research project, the idea of a literature review has 3 purposes. Number 1, it's to introduce your idea and the issue that you want to address. Okay, so for instance, let's say that your research project was looking at the differences between early language acquisition and late language acquisition on pronunciation skills. Okay, let's say that that was your study that you wanted to do. So here, that's what the introduction of your literature review should say. So your literature review should talk about this particular idea. So the purpose of our study is to look at the differences between early and late acquisition on the pronunciation skills of an individual who's going to be in their mid-20s, for instance. So here, presenting the idea to the audience is going to be very, very important for a literature review. The second part of the literature review is going to now begin to discuss the actual background. Now, part of the discussion of the background is also that you need to discuss your constructs and your operational definitions. Very, very important. We've been talking about constructs and operational definitions for a couple of weeks. So here now, in your literature review, you should be able to discuss what your constructs are and what your operational definitions are. So in other words, what do you mean by early language acquisition? What do you mean by late language acquisition? What do you mean by pronunciation skills? What does all that mean to us? So explaining that in detail with an operational definition. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. Now we begin to introduce the literature. This is where part of finding the research articles is very important. So to find your research articles, I expect that you all are going to use peer-reviewed journal articles for the purposes of your literature review. Can you use other resources? Yes, you absolutely can. You can use conference presentations, you can use theses, dissertations, you could use anything that you want. But I want peer-reviewed content as well. And I've given you all specifics in terms of what kind of content I'm looking for the purposes of your literature reviews in this particular case. So how many peer-reviewed journal articles I want. And if I remember correctly off the top of my head, I said 5 journal articles. Is that correct, guys? I can't remember off the top of my head. Okay, I think I mentioned that I wanted 5 peer-reviewed journal articles for the purposes of your lit review. If I said more than that, now you guys only get to do 5. Everyone good? Perfect. So that means finding 5 peer-reviewed journal articles related to your topic, giving us the background associated with your topic. So in other words, what has the literature already said about pronunciation? What are some of the effects of early and late language acquisition? Maybe nobody's done a research study on early and late language acquisition effects on pronunciation skills of 20-year-olds, but maybe they've done it on children. Maybe they've done it on the elderly. Maybe they've done it on comprehension skills. Maybe they've done it on anxiety provoking issues related to language production. Whatever the case may be. Here we find the literature and we talk about what the purpose of our study is in conjunction with the past literature. So in other words, this is what other researchers have already said related to issues that we're interested in exploring in our particular paper. After you're done presenting your literature, now the third part of your lit review comes into play. And the third part of your literature review is now again presenting what the purpose of your research study is. So again, presenting that we're interested in examining the differences between early and late language acquisition on pronunciation skills. Now you also present your hypothesis for your research study, so your prediction. So based on the literature, right? So we just talked about all these journal articles and about all the research that's been done associated with this specific topic. This is now what we predict is going to happen in our research study based on their previous findings. And remember, a hypothesis is a prediction based on previous evidence. And what that means is that you look at the previous evidence, all the literature, the part that you just wrote on the background, and what does it tell you to predict? So in other words, you keep finding that as stress goes up, memory performance goes down. As stress goes up, memory performance goes down. What are you going to predict? That as stress goes up, memory performance is going to go down. Because that's what the literature's been telling you to predict. Everyone with me so far? Perfect. Same thing goes for our lit reviews. Do the background, and then after you do the background, after you've read all the background and you've written the background part here of your lit review, now you incorporate the aspect of the prediction. So what does it tell you to predict? After we've introduced our prediction, our hypothesis, justify your prediction. So now after you've actually said, we predict that X, Y, and Z will happen, justify it. Why do you predict that that's going to happen? From what research articles did you find that information? So here you're going to say, we predict that as stress goes up, memory performance go down because previous researchers such as De La Garza and Kane, 2005, have found that as stress goes up, comprehension goes down. We're going to assume that as stress goes up, memory performance as a whole will go down based on their evidence. Everyone with me? Perfect. Now the last part of your literature review after you've done that is just wrapping up the entire lit review. Don't just end it abruptly after the justification and be like, done. I'm good. I've done the 3 parts. I'm finished with this. No, wrap up the literature review and create a nice smooth transition for the next part. And the next part of our paper that we're going to be working on is going to be your method section. Now here it doesn't specifically have to talk about what the methodology is going to be or anything like that, but at least just wrap up what the literature review had talked about and what you hypothesized to now introduce the next section that we're going to be working with. Questions, concerns at this time? All right, everyone good? Any questions in regards to your literature reviews? Absolutely, absolutely. And if you guys have any questions or concerns in regards to anything related to the content of the lit reviews, please talk to me, email me, let me know, and tell me, hey, sir, I have a question in regards to this. I really don't know what to do or what direction to go. I can't find journal articles. There's tons of journal articles out there, but sometimes we get so stuck in the idea that, there's nothing out there specifically on what I want to look at. That's okay. Don't worry about that. If there's no specific journal article related to your specific topic, that's okay, as long as we're able to kind of bridge that gap in terms of what it is that we want to do.
Is there a page requirement for reviews, and each one should be like a brief summary of what we're going to write? Read, summarize the whole thing.
Exactly right. Exactly right. In other classes, you guys may have done what are called like a critical analysis, and a critical analysis where you essentially do like a 2-page summary of a journal article that you read. I'm not looking for that. That's not what a lit review is for us in terms of empirical research papers. That's good for you to be able to do that and then use that summary that you just did for the purposes of a lit review. But here what we're looking for is give us specific information about what the researchers did, how they did it, what they found, what it means, and how it applies to your current research project. That's essentially what the idea of a literature review is, and then piecing it all together in terms of nice, smooth transitions that tell a story about what the literature has actually done. Any other questions or concerns? Everyone good? Okay. And again, there is no page requirement. So for some of you, you might be able to condense it into 3 or 4 pages. For others, they may need 6 or 7 pages. That's perfectly fine. I don't expect anybody's going to turn in like a 1-page lit review because that's not going to happen. Or even a 2-page. But, don't worry about the length of it. I'll be the judge of that. As long as you feel that you provided the content that's needed, you'll be okay. Everyone good? All right. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end class for tonight. I think this is a good stopping point for us. And even though I can't see your faces, I'm going to assume that there's this glazed over look in your eyes that you're like, I'm done. I'm done with this. Yeah, I'm 99% sure I'm right. That's what happens in research methods most of the time. I get the glazed over look or the deer in the headlights look of like, I don't know what's going on. But we'll be okay. We'll reconvene on Tuesday of next week, and there will be some things that have already been pushed on Blackboard for you all to complete for this week. All right? All right, everyone. Well, have a good rest of your night, and I will see you all next week. Bye-bye, guys.